When I first read Collecting Courage, I had to stop and sit with it. This book doesn't just tell stories, it lays bare the lived experiences of 14 Black fundraisers in the nonprofit sector across Canada and the United States. This book is raw, intimate, and deeply revealing. These stories of survival in a sector that prides itself on doing good, but too often overlooks the harm happening within its walls. The writers speak to the exhaustion of being last hired, first fired, overlooked, and silenced. They show us what it means to develop survival mechanisms, not just to navigate racism, but to keep going despite it. Collecting Courage isn't just a collection of essays. It's a challenge to the nonprofit world and an invitation to the rest of us to listen, reflect, and act. Today's conversation is one I hope makes you pause, not in guilt or defensiveness, but in deep reflection. Through storytelling and activism, we're unpacking the weight of generational trauma, the cost of shrinking oneself to fit in, and the profound mental toll of racism. Back with us on #Fempire to take us through this journey is Nneka Allen, founder of the Empathy Agency, Inc., co-author of Collecting Courage, and a force for truth, justice, and love. Nneka is a builder of brave spaces, a leadership coach, and a relentless advocate for community and equity. She takes us through her powerful journey, offering reflections on the experiences of Black people in today's society, where wokeness and the fight for justice are increasingly under attack. She reminds us that love, courage, and community are not only acts of resistance, but essential tools for survival and pathways to liberation. This episode is about waking up to these issues and staying awake. So let's get into it with Nneka Allen. In Collecting Courage, there's a powerful line in Chapter 2 by Sherry James. And she talks about first seeing the murder of George Floyd on TV, and she was reflecting on it, and she wasn't really fazed by it. At least that's how I interpret it, because sadly, it's reality for Black people to see and hear this. We can go through a list of many names of violent loss of Black lives: Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor. This isn't new, unfortunately. But it wasn't until, she says, I was forced to notice it because the white people around me were reacting and they were upset. So with this passage and the situation at hand, what does it say to you that so many Black people weren't shocked, but instead were watching others finally begin to wake up on this issue a bit more?
This question, I want to go in a couple of different directions. But one, I think it's important to just acknowledge that when George Floyd was murdered and his murder was captured on video, that story, that visual story, made it really difficult for white people to deny. And so they were confronted with the violence that we endure on a daily basis, in a variety of forms, of course, which is a part of the reason why Sherry wasn't particularly fazed. And I think the reality is, for Black people, if we reacted every instance of racial violence that we witness or experience, we would be unwell, really, in some ways, perhaps overwhelmed by it. How do we survive the varying degrees of racial violence we experience in our lives throughout our everyday, and then also live our life? There are mechanisms that we have to develop to do that. And so I don't blame Black people for developing those mechanisms to try and survive. I do think, though, that it's critical for us to be thinking about what it means that we have to develop mechanisms to survive. And one of the things that I point to in this Substack is about our mental wellness, our mental well-being. and how racism and unemployment bear down on us and have a direct impact on our well-being. And so to witness racism, to experience racism has a health impact. And so how you survive that is an individual thing. But I do think, because white people were sitting up and paying attention, Black people had to lean into the pain perhaps more. And I can remember white people calling me and apologizing and asking me to, tell them what to do. And I remember saying to them, that's not for me to do. Don't call me and apologize. This has been going on forever. I mean, you wake up and figure out how you can change your life so that I can have a better life, so that Black people can have a better life. Like, you have a role and responsibility in this. If you let this wake you up to that, will be great. I think some white people woke up for a period of time. I don't know that they're still awake 5 years later.
Yeah, I think a lot of points we can look to is when the idea of activism, and I'm putting air quotes in because when George Floyd was murdered, there was the Black Square movement on Instagram. And it was like, oh, people who've never been vocal about this are suddenly just reposting because that's what activism looks like. And I think social media makes it easier to think people are activists, right? You're liking and reposting and you think you're doing a better cause, but why does not activism not span beyond the screen, beyond the apps? It is a good thing in theory to raise awareness, but there needs to be that double down effect of also doing that through your actions. Another thing that comes to mind with people waking up, and I don't know if this is spoken about enough when we're looking at the historical context of things, is I don't believe there has been a generation where Black people and Black communities haven't unfortunately seen themselves or known of someone who experienced violence. And I'm thinking of the Jim Crow era, segregation, these eras of our history where Black people would have routinely experienced violence. You looked at a white person the wrong way. You might have been beaten up on the spot, been accused of horrendous things that were not true. Being lynched was routine in the South for Black people, and men particularly were castrated. And this is people's grandparents who saw this. This is still well within living history, living communities, when we're looking at the generational scheme of things. And that institutional side of police brutality has always been there. There's always been this public element to the attack on Black bodies. But now we have that visual aid with the phones, and we're seeing it play out on camera. And also the video element of it. This Is America by Childish Gambino, when that came out, I don't think people understood the message behind that and the timing of it. And like you said, I think people were on it and really into it at the time, but we've fallen back asleep, unfortunately. And these aren't conversations you fall back asleep on.
Absolutely. I mean, again, back to language, there's this assault on being woke. And I think that for me as a Black woman, it's wild to watch that assault on language occur when all you have to do is have a basic analysis to know that being awake and aware to injustice is critical, actually matters. Because what's the opposite of woke? Blissful ignorance? Like being asleep? So you want to be asleep at the wheel? No, thank you.
I want to go to your experience, how you've worked at an organization that was dedicated to mental health, and their vision and their slogan is mental health for all. But you working in that space, you realized very quickly that all perspective didn't include you. So looking back, what does it say about who is and isn't seen or served in mainstream mental health spaces? And why do you think conversations about the impact of racism on mental health are so absent, especially in organizations that should be leading that charge around these conversations?
Mhm. So this question, I don't know that I'm going to be able to answer it fully, but I'm going to take a stab at it. The fundamental question that has to be explored underneath the question you asked is, who is considered to be human?
Yeah.
That question's important because chattel slavery is born out of the belief that Black people are not fully human. And when you believe that people are not human, you can exclude them from things as basic as healthcare. You certainly would not consider the impact of violence on their mental well-being. And so, in order to answer that question, we have to actually get to, well, who is actually considered to be fully human? And how does that play out on a policy level? And how does that play out on an organizational level? How does that play out on an individual level? It's only once we get to a place socially where we actually believe and our behaviors and our policies follow the beliefs that Black people are fully human and have a right to be cared for, these institutions and systems will change.
And when we're talking about these institutions changing, it's not going to be an overnight fix, and that's the reality. And I want to dive into the point here about in your book, Collecting Courage, there seems to be this common theme about a simulation. Writers unpack what it means to navigate white spaces, to leave your Blackness at home, to not show up as your own authentic self. And many of the writers describe times where they had to abandon their true identities to avoid being silenced, and even that proved to be no guarantee for their safety. And it came to be sometimes an ultimate career limiting move, as one author described it. How do you begin to heal or reclaim your identity after spending so much time shrinking yourself just to survive in white dominated spaces? And what does it take for individuals and organizations to create these environments where Black professionals don't have to choose between authenticity and career survival?
Mm. Well, communities of color, communities of Black people are critical in the reacclimation of identity, in the liberated expression of Black identity. And so that's one of the reasons why the Black Canadian Fundraisers Collective exists, so that we can gather as Black fundraisers and be ourselves. Our identities can be bolstered because we're together and we're reflecting back to each other who we are and why that's valuable. So I think community is critical. And so, caucusing is one of the ways we sometimes see that happen in organizations. And caucusing, I think, has real utility, not just for Black people and people of color, but for white people too. But when we're talking about racism and white supremacy culture, and assimilation is a central tenet of white supremacy culture, we're talking about power. And so if organizations are committed to changing the cultural dynamic in their organizations so that Black people don't have to shapeshift, code switch, then we're actually talking about how they're going to share power. Because in the sharing of power, Black people can then bring their culture to bear inside the organization. Most white people don't want that to happen because they don't want the culture of the organization to change. They want to maintain white supremacy culture in their organization, but they're happy to have a Black caucus. You can have a Black caucus, but you actually got to shift power.
Yeah, it's not just the action. Like, yes, you can have that there, but it shouldn't just be a check mark. Like, they have to be part of that conversation, have a seat at the table, and lead it. And as we're just wrapping up here, I want to point to the final chapter of Collecting Courage, and it's titled, Our Love is Our Only Freedom. And it's a love letter from a daughter of the Underground Railroad, in which you wrote, and I want to quote because this really stood out to me. Love found me in 1999. This is when I fell in love with my Blackness, my identity, my people, and my history. Can you share with our listeners the context in which you found love for yourself?
Mm, yeah. This question makes me feel a little sentimental. Um, so I found love in Amherstburg, Ontario, which is the little town outside of Windsor where I grew up. It's a historic town. At a little museum that keeps the history of my ancestors and other descendants of the Underground Railroad and enslaved people. And even when I wrote this chapter, I struggled in some ways to fully articulate the environment, the context you're asking about, where I found love. But let me say this to you. I was absolutely changed by being in an environment that looked like me, that recognized me, that told the story of the people who are responsible for me being here. And I had the immense privilege of pouring over, I should say, historical documents for the better part of 6 months. And when you're touching primary documents for that length of time, and if you're a person like me who I'm always looking for patterns, there was one pattern that I could not escape, and that was the sheer coordination and commitment to community that all of these freedom seekers brought to the AME church movement. And the AME church, African Methodist Episcopal Church movement, was very much intertwined with the Underground Railroad. If you look on maps to see where AME churches are and the routes of the Underground Railroad, there is huge overlap. So that marked me, that changed me. You know, I grew up, my parents telling me about my maternal family history, which is family history, right? Which is pretty spectacular. But when I was able to bring that history and drop it into this larger context, and I could see, oh, this is our whole community that's generous and brave and willing to defy the law to achieve liberation. The amount of pride and groundedness and right to exist was communicated to me not through words. It was a felt sense. It was something that I absorbed from the environment. And as the Nazarene Church was nearing the completion of its restoration, we had the honor of going into a small space in the back of the church. Visitors can't go because it's a little bit on the dangerous side. But there's this crawl space, so to speak, at the back of the church. And you can't stand up in it. You go down a few stairs and you kind of have to be hunched over to be in the space. But this is where refugee slaves hid. And so I say that to you to say you can't stand in that place and not get a real sense of who you are and where you came from and what you can overcome. And so it completely changed me. And all of the history around that church, around that museum, from my vantage point, was rooted in love. It was rooted in the deepest desire to exist and to persist and to bring all of our beauty and strength to bear so we could be in community with one another. And so, yeah, I can't be a part of that community and not know who I am, who I actually am. And nobody can argue with it.
I just got so many goosebumps. I got goosebumps reading it, and hearing you say it now is just even more emotional. Like I'm getting a little teary-eyed because I think as a historian myself, it's one thing to read about what's happened in history, the atrocities, but being able to physically be there and touch the resources, like you said. I'm envisioning it now. And earlier this year, I went to Amsterdam and got to see Anne Frank's house. And again, these physical embodiments of history are so important and we need to preserve them. Um, so I want to thank you so much for sharing that really powerful statement. And I hope it's a wake up call for people to connect with their roots and their ancestors and get to know who you are, because we all have a history. And I think there's so much empowerment and self reflection to be able to see that and feel it. And you mentioned, and I want to dive into that point, when you were there, you have this overwhelming feel of love. And as you've reflected on your journey and seeing again where your ancestors walked, how do you reflect on that and your own place in the world today?
Mm. Well, I think I definitely have a very strong sense of responsibility. I feel like I must match their courage in many ways. I think it's critical for me to appreciate the context that they lived in so that I can understand more fully what my responsibility in this context is. So, the things that they did in the face of threats of violence and doing things that were at the time illegal, you know, it informs what my activism ought to look like. And so I think I carry the weight of that responsibility as I think about what's happening around me. It's probably a motivating reason why I write so straightforwardly about anti-Blackness and what that looks like in my life and in the lives of people around me. I don't want to shirk my responsibility or find myself unprepared to look in the face of white power. I want to be able to know that in the face of that domination and control that I stood up, no matter the consequences. In my foyer, I have the speech By Any Means Necessary by Malcolm X. And I bought that speech at the home of Martin Luther King Jr. in Atlanta. And I have it in my foyer because it's a reminder as I come and I go from this house that we deserve liberation by any means necessary. And so it's my job to figure out what that looks like in practical terms.
And I think that's just such a nice way to end it, especially when or you shared at the beginning of reflecting on what is your purpose here in this world and incorporating these deeply held values to your work and sharing that joy and these conversations with other people. I think is so beautiful that you've been able to cultivate that. And again, I just want to stress to our listeners, read Collecting Courage. It's such a raw, unfiltered account of what Black people have experienced in specifically the nonprofit sector. And if you're like me, I came up in the spoken word kind of space. I'm hemming and hawing as I'm reading it because it's just such powerful words on a page. You get goosebumps, you're laughing, you're crying because it's such a real account of these people. I felt like they were reading it to me. So really make sure you read Collecting Courage. And Nneka, I want to just thank you for this beautiful, insightful conversation. You're such a light, and I really look forward to our future conversations because this isn't the last. But Nneka, any other closing thoughts you want to share with our listeners?
Well, I just want to thank you, Julia, for your careful curation of this process and this conversation. Thank you for inviting me to go deeper into different topics and areas than I probably would have naturally. I really appreciate that. And final words. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, I want to encourage your listeners to live brave lives.
Beautiful. And I think that's something I'm going through the process of now. So I really appreciate also hearing it. So that was Nneka Allen. She's the founder of the Empathy Agency, Inc. Please reach out for any needs that you want to talk about, fundraising, nonprofit, or just want to have open conversations about racism and how you can contribute to this movement. So that was Nneka Allen. Make sure to tune in next week for my next special guest on #Fempire. I'll see you there.